Yes, they do have songs about parasites. Hello, microbiology students. I hope you're doing well today. This is going to kick off our discussion of protozoan parasites. As always, you have your learning objectives here on the slide. There is not a chapter exclusively devoted to protozoan parasites, and so I've given you the chapter references. So just a review, so parasites are going to live on a host, and when we talk about these types of parasites, they have to be inside a host to reproduce. And so we are looking at the eukaryotic parasites in this unit. So we're going to talk about protozoa today. So these are going to be animal-like protists, and they're going to be unicellular, and they are heterotrophs like us, meaning they have to get their energy and their carbon source from the host. Helminths, remember, they are multicellular worms, but their form that they're transferred in, or form of transmission, is going to be microscopic. So when somebody says clinically someone has a parasitic infection, it's either going to be a protozoan or helminths. Viruses, by definition, they too have to have a host to reproduce. So they're going to be acellular infectious agents, but typically if someone has a viral infection, they're just going to say, hey, they have a virus. They're not going to say, oh, they have a parasite. And so two groups of parasites, the protozoa and the helminths. So let's kick it off with a video.
Thinking like a parasite. I'm a parasite. I need food and shelter, and somewhere warm perhaps. And I don't want to go and find food. I'd like it to come to me. So I'm going to live inside another organism. I need a host. I could travel in the water, sneak into your glass of juice. Or maybe in food. Gobble me up and I can get inside you. Or perhaps I could just wait until one host touches another. I'm the champion of causing water and foodborne illness. I'm only tiny, so nobody will see me. In fact, some of us are just single-celled organisms, although you might spot one of the worms. Ooh, a human. They can be a great host for parasites, like viruses or worms. I also like animals too. I can go from human to human to animal to human, whatever comes my way. Hosts provide somewhere for us parasites to live, grow, and reproduce. But sorry, we do cause harm. We secrete toxins. And yes, we are sneaky. We don't want you to get rid of us, so we'll fight your immune system. But don't worry, we shouldn't kill you. Then I'd have no food. Sometimes you can hardly tell I'm here, but I guess sometimes parasites cause a lot of nasty symptoms. If you're lucky, you won't be a permanent host. Some of us parasites use different humans and animals throughout our developmental stages. I might even pop out when you're in the loo. Let's snuggle down into those tissues and organs. I like to be in the gastrointestinal tracts, but other parasites float around in the blood, like malarial parasites. Ooh, vitamins. I'll take those. And some amino acids too. No wonder I make you feel poorly. Sorry to harm you. I'm benefiting at your expense, but that's what parasites do. Whilst I'm here, I need to reproduce. Live, grow and multiply. That's what I say. I always reproduce at a much faster rate than my host. Anyway, host, thanks for my food, water, heat, habitat and impending transmission. I'm off.
So that was a nice introduction. So for our studies, we're going to be talking about the protozoa. So those are described as animal-like protists. There are other types of protists, so in the kingdom Protista, and I'm going to go back to my biology days because an easier way to kind of keep them straight is we're going to have the animal-like protists, we're going to talk about the plant-like protists, and then the fungal-like protists. And so all of them, like I said, are in that kingdom Protista. Plant-like protists, these are going to be algae. What makes them plant-like is that they are photoautotrophs, so they get their energy from sun and then they're capable of building their own carbon. They also have a cell wall like plants, but they are not plants. Most of them are unicellular. They can live in a colony, but most of them are unicellular and they are also aquatic. Fungal-like protists Then we have the slime molds and the water molds. So this right here is a slime mold. This is from your textbook. This is from my garden. So you often see slime molds that they live on land. They're all going to be on soil or on leaves or on plants surfaces. They're good decomposers. They are actually going to ingest things through phagocytosis, so they kind of become these little amoeboid-like cells. So they live off of decaying vegetation. Water molds look more fungal-like because they're more thread-like. So they are like fungus in that they secrete enzymes. They externally digest things and then they take them in through absorption. So slime molds, water molds, they are fungal-like protists, and we talk about algae, those are plant-like protists. These water molds, their little historical claim to fame, it was actually a water mold that caused the potato famine in Ireland in the 1840s, which is when a large group of Irish immigrants came to the United States. So that was a water mold. So as far as algae, we won't be talking a whole lot about them because they don't have a whole lot of medical impact. But there are the dinoflagellates, and so dino means terrible, so a terrible flagellate. They don't directly cause disease, but they do produce toxins. And so we're going to watch this about red tide, and then we'll talk about paralytic shellfish poisoning.
And our political editor, Craig Patrick. So, Craig, do they know what's causing this red tide or fueling it? And is there anything the state can do about it?
Well, let's start with the organism. Red tide is caused by a microorganism called K. brevis, and it's something that feeds off of a variety of nutrients. And it is spread in the Gulf by Gulf currents and by wind patterns. And this is ultimately what you get. You have a microorganism that produces toxins that kills marine life at the lower end of the food chain, and that can poison shellfish and seagrass, which sickens marine life as you work up the food chain. Toxins also seep into the air. It sickens people, particularly those with pre-existing breathing conditions. Red tide in itself, by the way, is nothing new. There are accounts of this off Florida coast for hundreds of years, long before Florida became commercially developed. But environmentalists say commercial development is certainly feeding it, making it far worse than it would otherwise be. And that's because this microorganism can feed off the nutrients in fertilizer that can seep from farms or lawns into the water. We know South Florida's Lake Okeechobee has been polluted with this kind of fertilizer runoff, and this polluted water from the lake has certainly been flowing into the Gulf to our south. So we have a clear correlation here between that flow of polluted water from Lake Okeechobee, which can feed red tide, to the red tide that we're seeing in the Gulf. But scientists have not drawn a direct link. They've not said the pollution has directly caused this outbreak of red tide. Again, red tide can and does occur naturally, and it feeds off of a variety of nutrients. In terms of what the state can do, obviously there's a growing focus on efforts to restrict or prevent pollutants like fertilizer from seeping into our water. Years ago, the state had a plan to buy out much of the commercial sugar farms near Lake Okeechobee, but that plan ultimately fell apart.
Yeah, and so this is not the same microorganism, the one called the green goop versus the red tide. These are different things?
Yes, they are different things. The blue-green algae bloom that you're seeing in Lake Okeechobee, that's caused by cyanobacteria, not K. brevis. K. brevis needs salt water to thrive, but cyanobacteria in the lake also feeds off of pollution from things like septic tank leakage and nitrogen and phosphorus-based fertilizer. And that cyanobacteria in the lake also causes health problems, and researchers believe long-term exposure may be linked to some very serious conditions, including Alzheimer's and ALS. So yes, we're talking about two different kinds of microorganisms, one causing the mess that we're seeing inland and the other causing the mess we're seeing in saltwater along the beaches, but they both can feed off of the same type of nutrient pollution, which has been flowing from farms in South Florida into Lake Okeechobee and has also been flowing from the lake into the Gulf, which brings us right back to that correlation we're seeing, but not necessarily a causation as it relates to what we're seeing, particularly on the beaches from Manatee County south.
Okay, so for newscaster, you've done such an awesome job describing the two different types of algal blooms. And there is definitely a correlation. Algae are normally in water anyway, along with those cyanobacteria. So they are always there, but they're usually not there in such high amounts. And so what's causing those blooms is nitrogen runoff, either from farms or also residentially. Everybody wants a pretty lawn. Everybody fertilizes their lawn, sprinklers come on, and then you get that extra nitrogen in the water and you get algal bloom. Some people experience coughing and sneezing when there is red tides and these algal blooms, but we're going to look directly at paralytic shellfish poisoning. When you get an algal bloom, when you get an overproduction of dinoflagellates, particularly Goniolax is a genus, so now there's more of them, and then you have these filter feeders, so shellfish, think mussels, clams, scallops, oysters. If you eat the body of a crab, it can also occur. So they're filter feeders. It doesn't bother them, but these dinoflagellates, they make neurotoxin, saxitoxin, goniotoxin, and then when ingested by humans, that's when you get paralytic shellfish poisoning. And so just as it describes, so paralyzed, it affects, once again, skeletal muscles. So within minutes of eating tainted shellfish, first step is going to be sort of tingling around the mouth and lips. And then it depends how much toxin was ingested. You can start to get paralysis. And usually it's going to be distally to proximally, so fingers, toes, and then working toward the trunk. And if someone doesn't seek treatment, it can also stop the diaphragm. So someone could die, basically lack of respiration. If someone really ingests a lot, I think that death, it takes like about 12 hours if it's going to occur. But they would go to a hospital and get an antitoxin and then also receive supportive respiratory care. We see the word protozoa. Proto means first, zoa means animal. You can remember that you go to a zoo to see animals. They're grouped together. They're actually finding out now that the way they used to group them has very little to do with their evolutionary relatedness. They are all unicellular. They are all ingestive heterotrophic organisms, so that's an animal-like characteristic. And they knew that they weren't fungi, they were different from slime molds or water molds. And so they just kind of put them together and called them protozoa, so animal-like protists. So once they started sequencing DNA and they started looking at ribosomal RNA, they came up with something else. And so then they came up with this mess. And yeah, they're not a unified group. And then this is a table from your book. I gave you a table to study, and I always kind of put locomotion. One, it kind of makes them easy to identify in lab. And then two, being modal also determines if they're going to need a vector. So think about something that is not modal, like an apicomplexan. The old term for that was sporozoans. So sporozoans, they're non-modal. They fall into this group, apicomplexan. And then this word sporozoa, they all make sporozoites in their life cycle. But I'm just going to kind of point out which ones are flagellates, which ones are cilia, which ones move by pseudopods, so amoeboid-like. Meaning, I'm not going to ask you this. So as far as their structure, yes, we are studying eukaryotes. They have a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. They do not have cell walls, so that makes them kind of animal-like. Their active stages do not, except there always has to be an exception, doesn't there? So these are foraminifera. Aren't they pretty? Yes, they are marine. They have these hard calcium carbonate shells, but they are protozoans. Traditionally, like I said, they're going to be grouped by locomotion. So cilia are those tiny, small hair-like appendages. Flagella are those longer whip-like ones. Pseudopods, false feet like an amoeboid, and then, like I said, the non-modal ones are the sporozoans and the apicomplexans. Algae, since they are plant-like, they have cell walls. The majority of the protozoa are going to be free-living aquatic organisms. They can, however, they are on soil, they can be in or on plants, and also on animals. They are great decomposers of many ecosystems. So some of them are parasitic, very few of them are, but they're going to live off of fluids, so our digestive fluids, our plasma. And they can also degrade tissue. Some of them have enzymes and toxins that can break down our tissue. They play an important role in aquatic food chains. They make up the zooplankton. So zooplankton, they are protozoans, but they're also small, microscopic, immature forms of insects kind of fall in the zooplankton. Yep, not sure if you were a SpongeBob fan, but plankton. So they are eaten by small crustaceans, and then small crustaceans like krill are eaten by the whales, and then the whale defecates, and then, yep, they're decomposers, and so they'll live off of that. So just, an example, circle of life. So they're important food chain link. They also, too, they're going to eat large numbers of bacteria, and they also eat algae. Yeah, they eat their protist brethren. Verbiage for next slide. Yep, I'm going to do it with a picture, but here is the words for you, those of you that are word people. So protozoans, and also too when we get to helminths, they have very complex life cycles. They are capable of sexual reproduction, they're capable of asexual reproduction. We'll look at that in a slide. Two things I kind of want you to know about their stages. They all will have a trophozoite stage, and so this is the active motile feeding stage inside the host. When environment gets to be harsh, so lack of nutrients, drier, those sort of things, then a protozoan is going to go through what's called encystment. So en means in. So the trophozoite is going to start secreting a tough, thick outer wall. And then usually, once we have a mature cyst, think of this is a dormant resting stage. And this is usually this stage that is going to be transmitted to another host. So an infective stage. So the cyst, when you see cyst at the end of something, so a cyst or an oocyst, that is usually going to be this stage that is going to be transferred from either the environment, a reservoir, or to the next host. Once it's internalized, then this needs to come out of the cyst. And so the cyst wall is going to break open. And so that's called excystment. So EX and then cyst, C-Y-S-T-M-E-N-T. So excystment. And so then the trophozoite, that feeding active form, then is reactivated inside the host. It's going to live off the host. It's going to reproduce. And then it's going to go through that encystment stage again. And so we're not going to really get into life cycles too much, but it's kind of important just to understand that the trophozoite, that's going to be the stage inside the host, and usually a cyst is produced, and then that is going to be that stage of transmission, so how it is spread from host to host or environment to host. So we look at protozoan reproduction. So up here, let's look at a life cycle typical of a gastrointestinal protozoan. And so we've got the trophozoite. Those are going to be the active stage in a host. So this is when they're feeding, they're motile, they're going through reproduction. Then when environment gets harsh, then they're going to go through encystment, and that's when they form that cyst stage. And cyst, it's dormant, it's hardier, it's got a wall. This is what is going to be passed in feces. This is what can then be transmitted to the next host. Then inside the host, typically in the intestine, we're going to get excistation. So that means it's going to come out of that cyst stage back to the trophozoite stage. And so we'll look at Giardia lamblia and Amoeba histolytica. And so these things can be picked up from the environment. Contrast that with Trichomonas vaginalis. And so it's kind of telling you it has to do with the vagina. Most men are asymptomatic, but it causes vaginal discharge, itching, and burning while urination. It is a sexually transmitted infection, meaning there's no cyst form, so you cannot catch this from the environment. We've got the trophozoite in the urogenital system, vagina of females, urethra of males. And then through sexual contact, that's how you can get transmission. It can also be contracted through vertical transmission, so from mother to child. So as the baby passes out the mother's vagina, it can lead to neonatal pneumonia. Also, this part right here, contaminated towels, underwear, much less likely. Yeah, usually when they describe these, it's incredibly rare, and sadly, usually it is a child that ends up with Trichomonas vaginalis, and so from a fomite. This trophozoite is by no means hardy as a cyst. Some of these cysts can persist for months. This can persist for hours, and so they're saying, oh, well, if someone who had it, that little trophozoite, was on the underwear, then it could be contracted, but much less likely. So protozoan reproduction can be either sexual or asexual. They have complex life cycles. So binary fission, so bi means two and fission means to split in half. So you get mitosis, you get cytokinesis, so you get two identical daughter cells. Schizogony, schis means to split. So if you're schizophrenic, you have multiple personalities. So schizogony. That's when there's many splits of the nucleus, and then delayed cytokinesis. So you end up with a very large cell with multiple nuclei. So binary fission, schizogony, those are asexual forms of reproduction. When we look at these life cycles, there are different types of hosts. So a definitive host, sometimes it's also called the primary host. That is the host in which that parasite reaches maturity and reproduces sexually. Intermediate or secondary hosts, this is a host that houses one or more of those developmental stages, so immature form. Only asexual reproduction, so binary fission or schizogony, occurs. Or sometimes it's just no reproduction. We'll also talk about dead end hosts. Sometimes a parasite will find itself in a host it did not intend to infect and cannot complete its life cycle. We'll look at visceral larvae migrans when we get to helminths, so that's an example of that. So interestingly enough, with malaria, the definitive or primary host is the mosquito. We are an intermediate or secondary host. And once again, it has to do with what type of reproduction is occurring and if that parasite is in its mature form or not. Things that do not make a cyst, since cyst is that hardy environmental dormant state that can be transmitted, other parasites will be transmitted by vectors. And so most vectors are going to be arthropods. So the vector is something that carries and transmits an infectious parasite into another living organism. So the Anopheles mosquito, the female, is the vector for malaria. All right, so I'm going to stop this video right here, come back for the next one on protozoan diseases of the gastrointestinal tract.